The moment a nation becomes valuable enough to be desired, its fate is no longer entirely its own. And long before the world learned to pronounce Venezuela's name with anxiety or outrage, a quiet question had already been asked in rooms far away. Who would control what lay beneath its soil, and at what cost? The land that would one day be called Venezuela first entered global consciousness not as a battleground or an ideological symbol, but as a promise. When Christopher Columbus reached its northeastern coast in 1498, he wrote of rivers so vast and fresh they seemed to pour directly from Eden itself. Indigenous communities lived along the shores of Lake Maracaibo in stilted homes, rising gently from the water. And it was this site that inspired the name Little Venice. Yet even then, the first misunderstanding was already taking shape. To the people who lived there, the land was not a commodity. To those arriving from across the Atlantic, it was potential, measured, claimed, extracted. Spanish rule settled heavily over the territory, less focused on building cities than on siphoning wealth outward. Venezuela was not Peru or Mexico. It had no immediate hoards of silver or gold. For centuries, it existed on the margins of empire, exporting cacao, coffee, and hides, governed loosely, neglected often, but never entirely ignored. That neglect would shape its future as much as any act of conquest. The colonial administration was thin, the elite small and insulated, the countryside vast and disconnected. Power flowed unevenly, and resentment accumulated quietly, generation after generation. When independence movements swept across Latin America in the early 19th century, Venezuela became a crucible of idealism and devastation. Simón Bolívar, born into privilege, yet driven by revolutionary fervor, imagined not just liberation from Spain, but a unified continent strong enough to resist future empires. His campaigns tore through the land, leaving villages burned, families displaced, and a population exhausted by war. Independence came, but unity did not. Gran Colombia fractured, and Venezuela emerged as a republic in name, fragile in reality, governed by caudillos, whose authority rested on loyalty and force rather than institutions. For much of the 19th century, Venezuela remained peripheral to global power. Its internal conflicts were frequent but localized, its economy agrarian, its politics personal. The United States, still defining its reach, paid little attention beyond occasional diplomatic recognition and commercial curiosity. Yet even in this period of relative obscurity, patterns were forming. Foreign creditors lent money to unstable governments. Local strongmen mortgaged future revenues to maintain control. Sovereignty became something that could be negotiated quietly, line by line, contract by contract. Everything changed when oil entered the story, not as a sudden discovery, but as a creeping realization. In the early 20th century, as industrial nations turned increasingly to petroleum to fuel ships, factories, and armies, geological surveys began to notice Venezuela's terrain differently. The first commercial oil well was struck in 1914, but it was the blowout at Barroso No. 2 in 1922, an uncontrollable geyser of crude that rained oil for days, that announced Venezuela's true significance. The ground itself had spoken, and its voice was impossible to ignore. At the time, Venezuela was ruled by Juan Vicente Gómez, a dictator who had consolidated power through repression and patronage. Gómez understood little about oil, but he understood control. He opened the country to foreign companies, American, British, Dutch, granting concessions that were astonishingly generous. In return, he received revenues that strengthened his rule and silenced rivals. For the companies, Venezuela offered something rare: vast reserves, political compliance, and proximity to the United States. For Washington, it offered energy security without the complications of colonial administration. This was not framed as domination, it was described as partnership, development, modernization. Roads were built to serve oil fields. Ports expanded to ship crude northward. Caracas began to grow, not as a center of industry, but as a hub of administration and consumption. The oil economy reshaped daily life unevenly. Some prospered quickly, many did not. Rural communities emptied as people moved towards cities that promised work but delivered instability. The state grew wealthy in appearance, but hollow in structure, dependent on royalties rather than taxes, accountable more to contracts than to citizens. As oil revenues surged, so did foreign influence, subtle and pervasive. American companies brought engineers, managers, and a way of doing business that assumed permanence. They lived in enclaves, spoke English, and operated with the quiet confidence of those backed by powerful governments. Decisions about production levels, pricing, and investment were made far from Venezuelan towns, yet their consequences were felt intimately when wages fluctuated, when land was expropriated, when labor unrest was crushed with state force. During the Second World War, Venezuela's importance deepened further. Oil became a strategic resource essential to Allied victory. Tankers sailed north under armed escort. The United States cultivated close ties with Venezuelan leaders, offering military cooperation and diplomatic favor in exchange for stability. It was during this period that a pattern hardened. Venezuela would be valued not for what it aspired to become, but for what it could reliably provide. After Gómez's death in 1935, the country experienced a cautious opening. Intellectuals returned from exile. Political parties formed. There was talk of reform, of sovereignty, of reclaiming control over national resources. The oil question sat at the center of every debate. How much should foreign companies pay? How much control should the state exert? How could a nation so rich beneath the surface feel so fragile above it? In 1945, a civilian-military alliance brought a reformist government to power, promising universal suffrage and social investment. For the first time, oil revenues were framed as a tool for national development rather than elite consolidation. But these changes unsettled powerful interests, domestic and foreign alike. When a military coup overturned the elected government in 1948, it was justified as a return to order. Stability, once again, took precedence over participation.
The dictatorship that followed under Marcos Pérez Jiménez embraced grand infrastructure projects and fierce repression. Skyscrapers rose in Caracas, highways cut through mountains, and oil money flowed freely into concrete and steel. To external observers, Venezuela appeared modernizing, prosperous, reliable. Beneath the surface, dissent was silenced and inequality widened. The United States maintained cordial relations, valuing predictability over principle, energy flows over political nuance. When Pérez Jiménez fell in 1958, toppled by a civilian military movement and mass protests, there was a moment of genuine possibility. Political leaders, haunted by the cycles of coups and authoritarianism, struck a pact to share power and avoid exclusion. Democracy, carefully managed, took root. Oil revenues funded education, healthcare, and an expanding middle class. For a time, Venezuela seemed to defy the region's instability, a model of democratic oil wealth. Yet the same dependency remained. The state relied almost entirely on petroleum exports. Political legitimacy was tied to distribution rather than production. When oil prices were high, tensions held. When they fell, tensions resurfaced. The nationalization of the oil industry in 1976 was celebrated as a reclaiming of sovereignty, but the structure of dependence changed less than its symbolism. Management replaced ownership as the central challenge, and global markets continued to dictate fortunes. Throughout the Cold War, Venezuela positioned itself as a moderate ally of the United States, democratic, anti-communist, dependable. Washington, in turn, viewed it as a stabilizing presence in a volatile hemisphere. This relationship was rarely dramatic, but it was consequential. Aid flowed quietly, intelligence cooperation deepened. The assumption persisted that Venezuela's path was aligned with American interests, and that alignment would endure. By the late 20th century, cracks had begun to show. Economic downturns eroded trust in traditional parties. Corruption scandals multiplied. In 1989, austerity measures triggered riots known as the Caracazo, leaving hundreds dead after security forces intervened. The social contract fractured visibly. For many Venezuelans, the promise of oil wealth had curdled into a sense of betrayal. It was in this atmosphere that a young army officer named Hugo Chavez attempted a coup in 1992. It failed, but his televised admission of defeat, brief, defiant, unresolved, resonated deeply. He spoke of dignity, of sovereignty, of unfinished missions. When he was later elected president in 1998, it was not as an anomaly, but as a consequence. Decades of accumulated grievance had found a voice. Chavez challenged the established relationship with the United States, not by severing it, but by reframing it. Oil would be used explicitly as a political instrument. Contracts were rewritten, alliances shifted, rhetoric hardened. To supporters, this was a long overdue assertion of independence. To critics, it was reckless confrontation. To Washington, it was a disruption of a relationship long taken for granted. But the deeper story was older than Chavez, older than oil nationalization, older than Cold War alignments. It was rooted in the moment Venezuela became valuable enough to matter consistently to external powers, and in the choices made thereafter. Choices to prioritize stability over inclusion, extraction over diversification, quiet agreements over public accountability. Each decision, reasonable in isolation, accumulated into a structure that left little room for error. The land that once seemed peripheral had become central. The oil that promised security delivered vulnerability. The alliances built on convenience proved brittle under strain. None of this unfolded inevitably. It was shaped by people, presidents and generals, engineers and workers, diplomats and villagers, each acting within constraints they did not fully control, yet contributing to outcomes they would later inherit. Long before headlines, before sanctions and speeches and accusations, Venezuela's importance to America was established not by ideology, but by need, not by conflict, but by reliance. The history was written quietly, in contracts signed without fanfare, in alliances maintained without reflection, in assumptions that endurance equaled consent. And when those assumptions finally faltered, the weight of everything that came before pressed forward, reminding the world that no moment arrives unprepared and no crisis stands alone.